1,036 days. That is the entire span of the administration of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Yet those 1,000 days have captured the imagination of the American public like no other has done in all the nation's history. Part of that lies in the fact that Kennedy was so young when he was cut down, and the suspicious circumstances that surrounded his assassination, whether real or concocted. Another part lies in the two families from which he descended, workers of Ireland who became princes and princesses of America. As with anyone who has achieved mythic status, there lies behind the story a great deal of, well, myth. For all his flair and charisma, the Kennedys had their demons. Some of them continue to haunt this family as much beset by tragedy as by wealth and power. John F. Kennedy's was a presidency far from perfect politically. Nonetheless, his legacy remains largely in the minds and hearts of both his supporters and his detractors, and it is a legacy worthy of examination.
Thus we look at the illusion of Camelot, and we see the person of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the election of 1960, the new frontier, the best and the brightest, the debacle in Cuba, engaging the Soviets, and the shadow of Southeast Asia, and finally, assassination.
Two sons of Ireland who were politicians of America. On the left is Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy, born January the 14th, 1858, and lived until May the 18th, 1929. Kennedy was the son of Irish immigrants from County Wexford, the only surviving male in the family following two outbreaks of cholera. He started work at 14 as a stevedore on the docks of Boston. He rose and owned 3 saloons and a whiskey import house. Eventually, he parlayed that into major interests in coal and banking. He then moved successfully into politics. As a social man, was able to mix comfortably with both the Irish and the Protestant elite, and he sat in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and also in the Massachusetts Senate. His particular talent was for behind-the-scenes machinations, for which Boston politics became so notorious. On the other side to his right stood his rival, John Francis Fitzgerald, nicknamed Honey Fitz, born February the 11th, 1863, and lived until October the 2nd, 1950. He, too, was born to Irish immigrants from counties Limerick and Cavan, and he was a Democratic congressman who went on to win 2 terms as mayor of Boston and made several unsuccessful runs for governor of Massachusetts. Fitzgerald made major improvements to the port of Boston. He became a patron of the baseball team now known as the Boston Red Sox. He maintained a very high profile in the city, with a theatrical style of campaigning and his personal charm and charisma that earned him the nickname Honey Fitz. P.J. Kennedy and John Fitzgerald were rivals politically, but then they became allies, and this alliance was sealed with the marriage of Kennedy's eldest son, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., to Fitzgerald's eldest daughter, Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald. They met each other when their families were vacationing in Maine. Kennedy was a leading member of the Democratic Party and of the Irish Catholic community. President Roosevelt appointed Kennedy to be the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which he led from 1934 to 1935. Kennedy later directed the Maritime Commission and served as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1938 to late 1940. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Joseph Kennedy was pessimistic about Britain's ability to survive attacks from Nazi Germany. He was well known as a defeatist, and he was no fan of Britain anyway, being an Irish Catholic. During the Battle of Britain in November of 1940, Kennedy publicly suggested that democracy was finished in England. It may be here in the United States as well. After a controversy regarding this statement, Kennedy resigned his position and came home. Rose Kennedy would become the doting mother of 9 children But although Joseph provided well for their family, he was an unfaithful spouse. His affairs included one with the actress Gloria Swanson of Sunset Boulevard fame. When Rose was 8 months pregnant with the couple's fourth child, Kathleen, she temporarily went back to her parents, returning to Joseph after her father told her divorce was not an option. In turning a blind eye to her husband's affairs, Rose depended heavily on prescription medication. Rose was a strict Roman Catholic throughout her life and rarely missed Sunday Mass, even after her 100th birthday. Her strict Catholic beliefs often placed her at odds with her children, some of whom experienced divorce. The sons especially had problems with their mother because they gravitated toward their father's sexual behavior. She would suffer the death of her first 3 sons, one of her daughters, and see one of her daughters also committed to a mental asylum. The Kennedys were a family of incredible wealth. Joseph Kennedy had made his fortune essentially in bootlegging. But it was a family that was also dedicated to service, and it was a family that was beset by tragedy. Seated in the center is Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the patriarch of the family. Standing behind him and to his immediate left is Rose. The oldest of the family was Joseph Patrick Joseph Kennedy Jr., standing at the far right of the photo. He joined the U.S. Navy in World War II and served in Britain. He would be the first son to lose his life when, on August 12, 1944, an explosive on his plane detonated prematurely as they attacked German U-boat positions. Seated front left is Eunice Mary Kennedy, the 5th child, who would later marry Robert Sergeant Shriver. She became the founder of the Special Olympics, and her husband, Sergeant Shriver, was the first head of the Peace Corps. Eunice later became the mother-in-law to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Her daughter Marie married him. Second from the left is Jean Ann Kennedy. She is the youngest daughter who married Stephen Smith and later became U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Ireland and was one of the leading figures in the peace process in Northern Ireland. Seated second from the right is Patricia Helen Pat Kennedy, the 6th child of the family. She married English actor Peter Lawford, but then divorced him 12 years later. Pat Kennedy attempted to break into the all-male movie television producer profession and would be the first ever person to produce a cooking show on network television. On the right is Kathleen Agnes Kick Kennedy, the 2nd daughter of the family. When her father was serving as United States Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Kathleen made many friends in London and was the debutante of 1938. She worked with the Red Cross, where she began a romantic relationship with William John Cavendish, Lord Hartington, whom she married in May 1944. 4 months after their marriage, Hartington was killed fighting in Belgium. In 1948, Kathleen died in a plane crash flying to the south of France while on vacation with her new partner, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, and thus she became the 2nd Kennedy child to die prematurely. Standing at the top left is Rosemary Kennedy, the most tragic of all the Kennedys in many ways. In her early young adult years, Rosemary Kennedy experienced seizures and violent mood swings. In response to these issues, her father arranged for a prefrontal lobotomy for her in 1941 when she was only 23 years old. The procedure left her permanently incapacitated and rendered her unable to speak intelligibly. Rosemary spent most of the rest of her life being cared for at St. Coletta, an institution in Wisconsin. The truth about her situation and whereabouts was kept secret from the family for decades. She was initially isolated from her siblings. Her mother did not visit her for 20 years. Rosemary did go on to visit them later in her life and died in 2006. Standing in front of Rosemary is Robert Francis Bobby Kennedy, the 3rd son and 3rd to last child of the family. He would go on to serve as U.S. Attorney General, U.S. Senator from New York, and presidential candidate in 1968 until his assassination on June the 4th, 1968. We shall cover him a little later in the course. Seated on his father's lap is the youngest child, Edward Moore, Ted Kennedy, who later would become U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. And in the center, standing, is the second oldest, John Fitzgerald, Jack Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born outside Boston in Brookline, Massachusetts on May the 29th, 1917, at number 83 Beals Street. This is not far from where they will play the U.S. Open Golf Championship later this month. Kennedy lived in Brookline for the first 10 years of his life. He attended St. Aidan's Church, where he was baptized. He was educated through the fourth grade at the Edward Devotion School, the Noble and Greennow Lower School, and the Dexter School, all located in the Boston area. His earliest memories involved accompanying his grandfather, John Fitzgerald, on walking tours of historic sites in Boston and discussions at the family dinner table about politics, sparking his interest in history and public service. Here you see Kennedy at 9 years old in a football uniform from the Dexter School. In 1927, the Dexter School announced it would not reopen before October after an outbreak of polio in Massachusetts, and so Kennedy then went on to go to school at the Choate School. The family, which was very wealthy, spent summers and early autumns at their home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, called the Kennedy Compound. Hyannisport is a village located on Cape Cod. There they enjoyed swimming, sailing, and touch football, and Kennedy also began to start playing golf around this time. When Kennedy had started attending Choate, which was a prestigious boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut, his older brother Joe Jr. had already been there for 2 years and was a football player and a leading student. He spent his first years at Choate in his older brother's shadow and compensated with rebellious behavior that attracted, shall we say, a coterie of friends. Their most notorious stunt was exploding a toilet seat with a powerful firecracker. In the next chapel assembly, the strict headmaster, George St. John, brandished the toilet seat and spoke of a certain group of muckers who would spit in our sea. Defiantly, Kennedy took a cue and named his group the Muckers Club. However, he was also beset by health problems, and doctors at first thought he had leukemia. He did not, but it would be the beginning of a long struggle that Kennedy would have with pain and illness throughout his entire life. Originally, it was his older brother Joseph who was tagged as the hope of his father. Joseph Kennedy Sr. desperately wanted to have Irish Americans accepted into elite society, and he felt that a son in high-level politics would be the way. Jack was almost an afterthought to all of this, but pretty soon he would no longer be. In September 1936, Kennedy enrolled at Harvard, and his application essay stated, "The reasons that I have for wishing to go to Harvard are several. I feel that Harvard can give me a better background and a better liberal education than any other university. I have always wanted to go there, as I have felt that it is not just another college, but is a university with something definite to offer. Then, too, I would like to go to the same college as my father. To be a Harvard man is an enviable distinction, and one that I sincerely hope I shall attain." At Harvard, Kennedy tried out for the football, golf, and swimming teams and earned a spot on the varsity swimming team. Kennedy also sailed in the Star class and won the 1936 Nantucket Sound Star Championship. In July of 1937, Kennedy sailed all the way to France, taking his convertible with him, and spent 10 weeks driving through Europe with some of his friends. In June of 1938, Kennedy sailed overseas with his father and older brother to work at the American Embassy in London. In 1939, Kennedy toured Europe, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East in preparation for his Harvard Seniors Honors Thesis. He then went to Berlin, where the U.S. diplomatic representative gave him a secret message about war breaking out soon to pass on to his father, and to Czechoslovakia before returning to London on September the 1st, 1935, the day that Germany invaded Poland to mark the beginning of World War II. In 1940, Kennedy completed his thesis, Appeasement in Munich, about British negotiations during the Munich Agreement. This thesis eventually became a bestseller under the title, Why England Slept. Kennedy planned to attend Yale Law School, but canceled when American entry into World War II seemed imminent. In 1940, he attempted to enter the Army's Officer Candidate School. Despite months of training, he was medically disqualified due to his chronic lower back problems. On September the 24th, 1941, Kennedy got the help of the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence and joined the United States Naval Reserve and was commissioned as an ensign. His next stop would be the Pacific. In April of 1943, John F. Kennedy was assigned to Motor Torpedo Squadron 2, and on April the 24th, he took command of the PT-109, which was based at the time on Tulagi Island in the Solomons. The most famous island of the Solomons is, of course, Guadalcanal. On the night of August the 1st and 2nd, 1943, in support of the campaign against the island of New Georgia, PT-109 was on its 31st mission with 14 other PT boats, ordered to block or repel 4 Japanese destroyers. PT-109 was rammed suddenly at an angle and cut in half by the destroyer Armagiri, killing 2 PT-109 crew members. The floating crew now decided against surrender and swam numerous miles with Kennedy towing an injured man along the way despite injuries to his own back. For his actions, Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his conduct during and after the loss of PT-109. He also received a Purple Heart for his wounds. When later asked how he became a war hero, Kennedy joked, "It was easy. They cut my PT boat in half." At the conclusion of the war, Kennedy retired from the service and became a correspondent for William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire. Hearst and Joseph P. Kennedy had been good friends in their early days, and it was believed that Kennedy was going to go into journalism. In fact, he was a special reporter at the Potsdam Conference, which was the first conference in which Harry S. Truman attended as President of the United States to talk about the dispensation of Europe, the final establishment of the United Nations, and the decision by the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan to help bring the Pacific War to an end. Kennedy soon felt the Irish tug of politics and ran for Congress now as the family's political standard-bearer. In the 1946 elections, Kennedy defeated his Republican opponent in the general election, taking 73% of the vote. Along with Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy, Kennedy was one of several World War II veterans elected to Congress that year. As early as 1949, Kennedy began preparing to run for the Senate in the 1952 elections against Republican 3-term incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., whom you see shaking hands with Kennedy prior to a debate. Kennedy's campaign slogan was, "Kennedy will do more for Massachusetts." Despite the fact that most of Massachusetts went for Eisenhower, Kennedy defeated Lodge for the Senate by 70,000 votes. Unfortunately for Kennedy, he was absent from the Senate a good deal of the time with medical problems, especially regarding his lower back. In fact, at one point he was so sick that he received the last rites of the Catholic Church. While he was in the Senate, he wrote his most famous book, Profiles in Courage, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It was the story of several U.S. politicians who stood up against the crowd at important points in their lives. Now, this book was not completely written by Kennedy. It was written with the help of his close advisor, Ted Sorensen. In his run for the Senate, Kennedy's father financed the campaign, while his younger brother Robert emerged as an important member of the campaign as a manager. Robert had a tough edge to him, which made him an excellent campaign manager. As I said, although Eisenhower won Massachusetts in the 1952 election, Kennedy defeated Lodge. Jack Kennedy kept a very high profile when he was able to get out and about, and he often wooed stars like Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby and other Hollywood notables who were friends of his father's. At the 1956 Democratic National Convention, Kennedy gave the nominating speech for the party's presidential nominee, Adlai Stevenson. The highlight of this convention came when Stevenson, in an effort to create excitement for the ticket, made a surprise announcement that the convention's delegates would choose the running mate. This set off a desperate scramble among several candidates to win that nomination. A good deal of the excitement of the vice presidential race came from the fact that the candidates had only one very hectic day to campaign among the delegates before the voting began. The two leading contenders were Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee and Kennedy, who as a first-term senator from Massachusetts was relatively unknown at that point. Kennedy nonetheless surprised the experts by surging into the lead on the second ballot. At one point, he was only 15 votes shy of winning the nomination. However, a number of states then left their favorite son candidates and switched over to Kefauver, giving him the victory. In one of his finest moments, Kennedy decided against prolonging the vote and the campaign any longer, and made a magnificent concession speech. The narrow defeat raised his profile and helped Kennedy's long-term presidential chances. By losing to Kefauver, Kennedy avoided any blame for Stevenson's expected loss to Eisenhower in November.
In the election of 1960, for the first time, 50 states of the Union would participate in the election, Alaska and then Hawaii having been admitted to the Union in 1959. The Democratic race lined up with Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, Adlai Stevenson, twice a candidate, the nominee for president in 1952 and 1956 from Illinois, Pat Brown, the governor of California, and the father of the current governor, Jerry Brown of California, Stuart Symington of Missouri, who was supported by, you guessed it, Harry S. Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, the Senate Majority Leader, who would step in at the convention to see if he could secure enough delegates, and Wayne Morse, a liberal senator from the state of Oregon. And then there was Kennedy, who had delivered the vice presidential nomination speech, the presidential nomination speech in 1956 for Stevenson, and now was running for the presidency at the age of 43. The 1960 Democratic Convention met in Los Angeles, California, and Kennedy was nominated on the very first ballot. In somewhat of a surprise move, he chose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. Now, Johnson had made some pretty tough, mean attacks on Kennedy during the campaign, and yet Johnson being from Texas meant that Kennedy from the Northeast had a balance to his ticket and could deliver him a very important state in Texas. On the Republican side, the race came down to three major candidates. Nelson Rockefeller of New York, representing the old Northeastern Republicans called Rockefeller Republicans. Barry Goldwater of Arizona, representing the extreme conservative right wing of the Republican Party. And Richard Nixon, the vice president, also a very conservative, cold warrior, tough on communism type, who had been Eisenhower's vice president for the past 8 years. The 1960 Republican convention was held in Chicago, Illinois, and there Nixon was nominated on the first ballot. He then chooses Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate. And so Nixon, who is really a Westerner at heart, and Lodge, who comes from Massachusetts, the Northeast, same place as the Kennedys, are now the Republican ticket. In the fall of 1952, Henry Cabot Lodge found himself fighting in a tight race for re-election with John F. Kennedy, then a U.S. representative. His efforts in helping Eisenhower caused Lodge to neglect his own campaign. In addition, some of Taft's supporters in Massachusetts defected from Lodge to the Kennedy campaign out of anger over Lodge's support of Eisenhower. That's Robert Taft, by the way. In November of 1952, Lodge was defeated by Kennedy. Lodge received 48.5% of the vote. Kennedy got 51.5%. It was neither the first nor the last time a Lodge would face a Kennedy in a Massachusetts election. See, in 1916, Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. had defeated Kennedy's grandfather, John Fitzgerald, for that same Senate seat. Lodge's son, George, was defeated in his bid for the seat by Kennedy's brother, Ted, in the 1962 election for John Kennedy's unexpired term. So the Lodges and the Kennedys go way back. In the general election, the Kennedy campaign stated and hammered the GOP for having fallen behind the Soviet Union, for having created a missile gap, for having fallen behind the Soviet Union in the space race, that while the U.S. was making appliances, the Soviets were making rockets. Furthermore, they said that the Republican Party's record on civil rights had languished. The party of Lincoln had abandoned its principles, and that Eisenhower was not forceful enough during the segregation crises or desegregation crises of the 1950s. Kennedy, for his part, would get America moving again, build on the prosperity that was going on, and make it for all. He was endorsed by numerous Hollywood stars. For instance, Henry Fonda was a big supporter of Kennedy. Frank Sinatra was a big supporter of Kennedy as well. What were the Kennedy weaknesses? Well, first of all, his youth and inexperience were touted by many as a weakness. Kennedy said, and turned that to an advantage by saying, I'm not old and seasoned, that's true, but I'm also not old and rigid. Also, Kennedy's Roman Catholicism seemed to get in the way as well. Many people said that the Roman Catholics could not be effective American politicians because whenever it came to be a choice between Pope and church and state, Catholics would always go for the Pope and the church. Well, to address the fears among Protestants that his Roman Catholicism would impact his decision-making, Kennedy famously told the Greater Houston Ministerial Association on September the 12th, 1960, and I'm going to use my Kennedy impression here, I am not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. In other words, Kennedy's saying American first when it comes to affairs of state. The Nixon campaign, which did hammer Kennedy on his Roman Catholicism, said that it would continue the peace and prosperity that Ike had had for the last 8 years. Furthermore, Nixon was a seasoned Cold Warrior. He had a good record. He had gone after Alger Hiss and other communists in the government. He had engaged Khrushchev head-to-head in the famous kitchen debate. What were the Nixon's weaknesses? First of all, he had rather lukewarm support from his own president, Ike. Now, Ike supported Nixon, but one time Ike was asked to name one of Nixon's accomplishments while he was vice president. Ike, in a very jovial manner, said, well, if you give me a week, maybe I can think of something. Then he was attempting to be funny. But it was a poorly timed comment because the Kennedy forces got a hold of that and used it in their campaign ads. The other problem is that Richard Nixon was not as charismatic as John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had a constant smile on his face, radiant with those big Fitzgerald Kennedy teeth. Well, Nixon had a perpetual scowl on his face, and when he smiled, it always looked artificial, like he had to be reminded to smile. A very dour-looking man, not a handsome-looking man at all. He just didn't have the gravitas that Kennedy had. But Nixon had very good political instincts, and he made up for his lack of charisma with those political instincts. What made this election groundbreaking was the fact that the two presidential candidates decided to engage each other in a series of live debates. For the very first time, two candidates for president would engage each other in debate. Now, you're starting to think, Lincoln Douglas. Well, that was not the presidential race. That was a Senate race in Illinois that made Lincoln and Douglas famous throughout the nation, especially Lincoln. They would engage in 4 presidential debates. The first debate was the key. It was watched by over 70 million viewers. And in it, Nixon had come straight from the campaign trail, whereas Kennedy took time off from the campaign to prepare. Nixon had had a leg injury, and he had been given a shot that had made him ill. He went on TV looking ill. He refused makeup, and so his 5 o'clock shadow was showing. He did not prepare nearly as much. He looked uncomfortable. His eyes were moving all around the stage. The stage set was in such a way that the back wall was painted gray. Nixon wore a gray suit, made him look diminutive as opposed to Kennedy, who always wore a dark suit. Kennedy looked tanned, confident, very well prepared. And when the first debate was over, those who watched the debate said Kennedy won this one hands down. However, those who listened on the radio stated that, not so fast. Nixon seemed to win the race. However, many people have later pointed out that those who listened on the radio were very few, and that they tended to be supporters of Nixon even before the race. The final 3 debates, Nixon had recovered by then, and he looked more forceful. And in the third debate, the candidates debated via split screen from different locations, but the number of viewers in the second, third, and fourth debates were much lower than in the first debate. And so it did not have the impact that Nixon had hoped for. And while all this was going on, Martin Luther King was arrested for a sit-in down in Georgia. Nixon gave no response, saying it's not for the job of the federal government to get involved. Kennedy, for his part, however, wrote a very strong letter to the governor of Georgia demanding action and basically saying, if I'm elected, you're not going to be getting away with this sort of thing anymore. This, of course, made Kennedy look very good in the eyes of the African American population, who had now been long shifting from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and that basically finished the whole turn. The voters of America went to the polls on November the 8th, 1960. When it was all said and done, 100,000 votes was the difference between John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon. Kennedy won 303 electoral votes. He won 22 states. He got 34 million votes, and that was 49.72% of the popular vote. Nixon got 219 electoral votes. He captured 26 states. Now you understand how the Electoral College works these days, don't we? He got 34,108,157 in votes. He got 49.55% of the popular vote. It was one of the closest races in all United States history. But in the end, John F. Kennedy came about. Many charged that a lot of the cemetery vote in Chicago, the quote-unquote voting of people who had been dead for many, many years, helped Kennedy get over the top, and that there was some charges of election fraud down in Texas, but not enough of it was proven to make a difference. There you see the electoral map. showing the states that Nixon won, that Kennedy won, and in the Deep South, you had the states of Mississippi and Alabama gave their electoral votes to non-candidates, actually. Robert Byrd, a former Klansman and then senator from West Virginia, and Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat candidate who had run against Truman in 1948, and the longtime member of the Senate from South Carolina.
President Kennedy took the oath of office on January the 20th, 1961, and then called on the nation. He called on the spirit of the nation, especially its young people, to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Among those young people who came away incredibly impressed by his meeting with the president was a high schooler from Hope, Arkansas, named William Jefferson Clinton, a future president of the United States.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats.
The words and rhetoric of John Fitzgerald Kennedy were soaring as it called Americans to a new frontier, to stretch the limits of American can-do, to see that there was no place we could not soar. And he carries that on in his inauguration. January the 20th, 1961, he yells out to the crowd, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." And there's my little Kennedy impersonation again. He is leveling a challenge directly at the youth of the nation. And his signature accomplishment when it comes to the youth of the nation is the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps would be the shock troops of American democracy. They would bring their youthfulness and their energy and their American know-how to the third world and help develop better water systems, better forms of agriculture, better technology, and so forth. He would choose as his first director for the Peace Corps his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, who was married to his sister and would produce Maria Shriver, of course, and she was the one that's married to Arnold Schwarzenegger, or was married to Arnold Schwarzenegger, I should say. What are the aspects of the new frontier? Well, their unemployment and benefits were expanded to help people who were out of work. Aid provided to cities to improve housing and transportation, to see if they could stem the growing decay of the inner cities. Funds allocated to continue the interstates. A Water Pollution Control Act. My, how we need one of those today. Agricultural Act to raise farmers' incomes. Anti-poverty legislation passed by Congress, knowing full well that despite the fact that America had had a boom in the 1950s, not all shared in it. Anti-recession public works packages to get people back to work, building things that were useful. Measures designed to assist farmers in their planting. Major expansions of Social Security, especially when it came to hospital construction, library services, family farm assistance, and reclamation. When it came to Social Security benefits, you also had several housing bills, aid to any area that was economically distressed. You had food stamps for low-income Americans were reintroduced in order to get them healthy and also to stimulate the economy. Remember that food stamps in many ways are an economic stimulant to the rest of the country. Food distribution to the poor was increased. Expansion in school milk and school lunch distribution was implemented. You also had comprehensive farm legislation, especially with expansions in rural electrification, soil conservation, crop insurance, farm credit, and marketing orders. And many of these initiatives would be blocked by Southern Democrats. It smacked too much to them of quote-unquote socialism. And furthermore, these federal initiatives tended to help and assist African Americans, which undercut their power base in the South. With Kennedy's promotion of youth, he promoted it also in his cabinet. When he assembles his cabinet, he scraps the Eisenhower decision-making model for his own, in which he's going to help make the decisions, whereas many made the decisions for Eisenhower and then got him to essentially look it over and maybe correct it. He called it the wheel model. All spokes of the wheel lead to the president. He would mix experience with inexperience in his cabinet. And experience is not necessarily a bad thing as long as you're willing to learn. I think we kind of understand that nowadays. Key in his cabinet, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General. His brother often was called, derisively at times, the assistant president, and could gain or deny access to the president or for many certain people. McGeorge Bundy was his foreign policy advisor. McGeorge Bundy in many ways will help craft Kennedy's response to Vietnam. Ted Sorensen is his domestic advisor. What about Lyndon Johnson? He was largely relegated to the sidelines during the presidency, almost as if sort of a penalty box for all the mean things that he had said during the campaign prior to him being made the nominee. Heading the Secretary of State was Dean Rusk. At Foggy Bottom, they called it. Dean Rusk was a very accomplished bureaucrat and very good in helping others reach decisions. Running the Defense Department was Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara had come over from the Ford Corporation with a group of U.S. Army veterans who had learned a great deal in colleges and universities, and now we're putting scientific aspects to work in the cabinet for finding solutions to government problems. The problem of the cabinet was that many of these young guys, these smart guys, these whiz kids, were not relying on the old hands that existed, people that could have given valuable assistance. And one of the reasons why they didn't rely on them is that there was still the old taint from the loss of China back in 1949 and McCarthyism. And the other thing was the fact that the whiz kids like McNamara, the guys that came from the Ford and Rand Corporation, they were arrogant pricks. And they made no bones about letting people know just how smart they really were. And this is essentially the basis of the book by David Halberstam, the man you see in the picture there, The Best and the Brightest. And an in-close, in-depth look at the men who made up the Kennedy cabinet, who would then make up the Johnson cabinet, and who would then bring us into Vietnam and keep us mired in Vietnam for a time. I often have a fun time with those on the right who are absolutely dedicated to sullying Kennedy's reputation, that especially when they go around saying, oh, all you liberals, all you do is defend Kennedy and think he was the greatest president ever and he never made a mistake. And I'm like, oh no, absolutely not. We certainly understand that Kennedy was a flawed president, both personally and politically, and suffered major defeats. And one of the big defeats that he suffered came early on with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, the background to this is that the Batista government had been overthrown by the left-wing rebels of Fidel Castro in 1959. And Castro sought the aid and the help of the Soviet Union, and so Castro's Cuba became a communist nation. Well, the CIA almost immediately begins fomenting plans to overthrow Castro, and this had been created during the Eisenhower administration. What was the Bay of Pigs invasion supposed to be? It was a counter-revolutionary insurgency that was composed of U.S.-trained anti-Castro Cuban exiles and led by CIA paramilitary commanders. Kennedy gave his go-ahead to the plan on April 17th. The idea was for these men to get trained, nominally trained, sent over to Cuba, start fighting and saying, all you Cubans who want freedom, leave Castro and join us. That was the whole plan. They said people would just come flocking to them. Well, they land. Of course, the United States at first denies all culpability in any of this, which, of course, was totally, completely false. And there was no popular uprising after the invasion. And so on April the 19th, 2 days later, the Cuban government captured or killed the invading exiles. And Kennedy had the opportunity to send in air support, but immediately he regretted the decision in the first place and withheld air support from the Cuban exiles. So Kennedy was forced to negotiate for the release of 1,189 survivors. Cuba held on to them for 20 more months and subjected them to terrible imprisonment. And then they finally got them back for $53 million worth of food and medicine. This was an absolute debacle for the Kennedy administration. Yes, it had been crafted during the Eisenhower administration, but Kennedy was the one who had given the go-ahead. Kennedy was the one who had held back the air support, and Kennedy lost a great deal of face. Although his esteem went up in the eyes of many Americans because he admitted it, took responsibility for it, and said mea culpa, essentially. Well, the Cuban-American community has never forgiven the Kennedys, even to this day. Well, the incident also makes Castro wary of the United States. He says, the United States is never going to let us alone, and we are going to need some way to ensure our revolution. And he looks to the Soviets and he says, boys, can you help us ensure our independence from the United States? And the Soviets said, we have idea. Kennedy, the young man coming into the White House, wanted to prove his mettle early on. He wanted to prove his toughness. Eisenhower was 71 when he left the White House. Kennedy was 43. A big difference in age between the two men. And the Soviets looked at Kennedy and said, well, we're very impressed with this, but he is a young guy and can be pushed around. And so Kennedy wanted to prove his mettle against the Soviets, and he chooses to fight them mostly over Berlin. That was the main point of contention, was Berlin. Remember that at the end of World War II, Berlin had been divided into 4 zones, the U.S., French, British, and the Soviet zone. And then the U.S. had created the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviets blockaded Berlin. The U.S. did an airlift to lift the blockade, which was successful. But by 1961, the Soviets wanted to unite Berlin under East German domination. They were sick and tired of West Berlin sticking like a thorn in their side. And there were literally hundreds of thousands, and then later millions of East Germans were running across the border into West Berlin. Well, of course, the U.S. wanted to keep West Berlin exactly as it was. Well, Kennedy and Khrushchev come to a summit at Vienna, Austria, June the 3rd and the 4th, 1961. When he comes out, Kennedy basically said, he kicked my ass. Khrushchev was a very coarse man, a bullying man. He treated Kennedy with a great deal of contempt. Kennedy took that personally rather than the advice of General Charles de Gaulle, who said, don't let Khrushchev bully you, just simply brush it off and move along. When Kennedy comes out of the meeting, he says, we have a very long winter ahead. Despite the acrimony and the distrust, both leaders had actually opened up a dialogue. There was a 125-word joint statement, which was very terse and very bland, but the two leaders actually came out of it with something of a new respect for each other. Khrushchev had been tough on Kennedy, but in many ways it was just Khrushchev testing Kennedy and seeing. And so that when Kennedy came back the next time for the next summit meeting, Kennedy was much more on his guard and much more on his game after that. But the Soviets said, this Kennedy at this point, he's still learning the ropes. Let's see how far we can push him. Constantly shamed and infuriated by the loss of manpower from East Germany to West Berlin, the Soviets, with the East German government, erected what they called the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart, which we simply call the Berlin Wall, which existed from August the 13th, 1961 until November the 9th, 1989. Grand total of 28 years it sat up there. Started out as barbed wire and then concrete to seal off West Berlin and prevent those fleeing from East Berlin. On the eastern side, there was what was known as the death zone, where people caught in there would be shot on sight. On the western side of the wall became something of a grunge district in Berlin, with lots of graffiti and lots of kind of seedy punk rock clubs that grew up along there. Almost immediately when the wall went up, John F. Kennedy flew to Berlin. And there he made his famous speech in which he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means I am a Berliner. At least Kennedy thought he was saying that he was a Berliner in defiance of the Soviets, okay, that we all stand with Berlin. In truth, people of Berlin did not call themselves Berliners. A Berliner was actually a fruit-filled pastry that was a delicacy in Berlin. And so essentially Kennedy was saying, I am a jelly donut. Thought you might find that humorous. The next big thing were the missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis went on for 13 days, from October the 16th through the 28th, 1962. What had happened? U-2 spy planes. We had spy planes flying over the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and all communist countries. And U-2 spy planes took photographs of intermediate-range ballistic missile sites being built in Cuba by the Soviets. This was an immediate threat to the national security of the United States. And President Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine in doing that. He said that this is beyond the pale of just supporting a communist government. This is threatening the United States, putting missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida that could have hit any city. Kennedy sits down with his advisors. Some say, strike Cuba now, invade it, put it to an end. Kennedy says, no, that's going to start a war with the Soviets. They settle on a quarantine, an embargo essentially, but they don't call it an embargo, they call it a quarantine. And all Soviet ships approaching Cuba would be stopped and searched by U.S. Navy ships. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union tottered on the brink of nuclear war. On October the 29th, when people woke up, they woke up to find that the world was still there, and that Soviet ships were now heading back to Russia with the missiles on them. The missiles were, of course, shrouded. They said, oh, we're just taking out oil equipment. And the U.S. is like, sure, whatever you say. So the Soviets had retreated. The bear and the eagle had stared each other down, and the bear had blinked first. As a result, the U.S. decided to give in on removing ballistic missiles from Turkey and Italy, but those missiles had become outdated anyway, and now they were using submarines in the Black Sea to take care of that. But the Cuban Revolution had been affirmed, and that's why the missiles were there in the first place. They were not intended to be an offensive weapon against the United States unless the United States tried once again to overthrow the Castro regime. It is from this point onward that the United States leaves Cuba alone and simply has an economic and diplomatic boycott against them. What is also done is the fact that such back channels and convoluted ways of communication were being used between the president and the Soviet premier, that they said this is not good unless we can talk to each other directly and right away. And so they establish a hotline between Washington and Moscow so that the White House and the Kremlin and those inside of it can speak directly to each other. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the beginning of this period of thaw in the relations. This was the nadir of the Cold War, where we almost went to war against each other. From this point onward, things are going to improve between the United States and the Soviet Union. It starts with the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which ends all atmospheric nuclear testing. The U.S. also creates SAC, Strategic Air Command, where they keep B-52s in the air and fueled at all times. So even to this day, we still have B-52s flying near the fail-safe points near Russia, and Russia has their long-range bombers flying over the Atlantic near us, and they, still land in Cuba. What also dogged the Kennedy administration was Southeast Asia. French Indochina, which was Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, had been under control of France from 1883. But in 1954, the revolutionary organization known as the Viet Minh overthrew the French control in northern Vietnam and mandated that Vietnam be brought under northern control by Ho Chi Minh and the communists, and the south, which was run by France still, but France wanted to get out. And so in 1954 and 55, the Geneva Peace Conference split North and South Vietnam into its respective parts. Now, Kennedy, when he comes to the White House, sees Laos as the key during the Laos was seen as the key during the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy, when he comes to the White House, wants to have Laos as neutral. It would be Vietnam, in Kennedy's estimation, and in the estimation of his advisors, that would become the tripwire for the United States' stance against communists. This is where we're going to enforce the domino theory and containment. We're not going to let Vietnam fall anymore. So he increases the advisory support, which means he is sending U.S. soldiers over there, but they are not in combat roles. They are there to advise South Vietnamese Army regiments and divisions. Kennedy gradually begins to prop up the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, the shorter of the two men you see in the picture there. Ngo Dinh Diem had become president of South Vietnam in 1955. He was a Roman Catholic, educated in the United States, very cultured man, but he had a very corrupt contingent of people around him. Kennedy then sends Roger Hilsman to Vietnam to assess the situation and basically states that the communists are winning. We need to win their hearts and minds. And so they create what is known as the Strategic Hamlet Initiative to revamp the Vietnamese village system. It doesn't go very well. Kennedy also issues National Security Action Memorandum that essentially states that Vietnam is going to be a place where we need to become more involved. And then Kennedy sends his old political rival, Henry Cabot Lodge, as ambassador to South Vietnam to see if the Diem regime can be reformed. And if the Diem regime cannot be reformed, then unfortunately Diem is going to have to be removed. And so Kennedy authorizes a coup with the help of Lodge to go forward. And on November the 1st, 1963, Diem is removed from power in a very strange coup, which I do not wish to get into right now. Unfortunately, in the process of removing Diem from power, both Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, were murdered by soldiers. And Kennedy receives the word of this on November the 1st, which is All Saints' Day, a very important Roman Catholic holiday, and Kennedy is absolutely devastated by that news and goes into his private study and bows his head. And several of his advisors come in and say, "Mr. President, you shouldn't be upset about this. This is something you brought about. You're responsible for this." And of course, 3 weeks later, Kennedy met his own assassin. The assassination of President Kennedy took place on November the 22nd, 1963, exactly 21 days after ZM had been assassinated. The assassin of President Kennedy was Lee Harvey Oswald, a strange human being who had tried to defect from the United States to Russia, but the U.S. consul in Russia didn't take him all that seriously, and so really didn't file the paperwork, which allowed Oswald to come back to the United States after a time. He lived and worked in a variety of places. Oswald had been in the United States Marine Corps, served there, had achieved the rank of a marksman, but not an expert marksman. Why was John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963? Well, there was threefold reason he wanted to go. Number one, he wanted to help raise more Democratic Party presidential campaign fund contributions. He's putting money into the war chest, and Texas, with the oil boom at full bore, was the place to go. Secondly, he wanted to begin his quest for re-election in Texas in November 1964. And Dallas had been a city that did not go for Kennedy in the 1960 election, so he wanted to start it in that metropolitan area. Most importantly, there was a fight in the Democratic Party in Texas at the time because John Connally, the governor of Texas, who represented the conservative wing of the Texas Democrat Party, was fighting with the liberal wing of the Texas Democratic Party, and so Kennedy went down to Texas, and he brought Jackie with him. He said, "I'm going to need some heavy hitters to get on the good side of people." And he knew very well that Jackie was even more popular than him. She was a beautiful young woman, and her elegant manner and her vivaciousness was very attractive to many people. Kennedy goes to Fort Worth in the morning, then he flies over to Dallas, gets into the motorcade, and when they go through Dealey Plaza, Kennedy and Governor John Connally are shot in Dallas. Connally survives. Eventually, Connally will become a member of the Republican Party. Kennedy dies at 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, 12:30 Central Time. It was just an absolute catastrophic moment in the U.S., not in the sense that the government fell apart, the government stayed well socially. It was one everybody knew where they were. It was one of those moments. Eventually, Oswald was arrested in a theater after being suspected of killing a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit. And then Oswald was shot and killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby. And this, of course, led to the numerous conspiracy theories and so forth. This, of course, led Lyndon Johnson to put together what was known as the Warren Commission. It was chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, the famous Chief Justice who had issued the Brown v. Board of Education and would issue the Miranda ruling and a number of other rulings as well. Notable members on this committee: Hale Boggs of Louisiana, this House Majority Leader, and Gerald R. Ford, a congressman from Michigan, who himself one day would become president of the United States. The Warren Commission met over several months, taking in the accounts of witnesses and depositions and evidence, and they ruled the shooting the work of one man. That satisfied maybe half the country. The other half were totally unsatisfied by this. The funeral of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was one of the most spectacular things ever seen by a country. It was broadcast on all the major networks, and more than 1 million people crowded into Washington to line the route and pay their respects as the casket of the president came out of the White House. A funeral mass was said, at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. The homilist was Auxiliary Bishop Philip M. Hannon, a close friend of Jackie Kennedy, who would later himself become the Archbishop of New Orleans. It then laid in state in the Capitol, where those people were able to file by the casket in the rotunda. And then it began the long funeral train across the Potomac River to Arlington National Cemetery, where it rests to this day. I'm drawing your attention to a couple of things in this picture. You can see on the lower right-hand side Jackie Kennedy with her brother-in-law, Bobby Kennedy, and several of her sisters-in-law. Also draw your attention to the men in the khaki pants and the tan coats with their left arms all extended. That is a company of Irish Rifles. For you see, in 1963, earlier that March, John F. Kennedy had visited Ireland and gone throughout all of Ireland and visited his home county